Hello and welcome to the Remarkable Women, Powerful Stories, our regular leadership series by Zonta International. And I thank you so much for joining me once again today for our conversation with our guest, Houry Geudelekian. Welcome to you, Houry.
Thank you.
I'm Lynn Foley, Chairman of the Zonta International Leadership Development Committee, and hosting this series is an absolutely special highlight every month on my calendar. I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also pay that respect forward to any First Nations people present. Zonta International is a leading global organisation of professionals empowering women worldwide through service and advocacy, and it's now in its second century and has more than 25,000 members in 64 countries working together to make gender equality a worldwide reality for women and girls. So now it's my pleasure to make a short formal introduction to our guest today, Houry, who's joining me from New York. Firstly, here is a picture of some of her achievements. Houry Geudelekian was the previous Gender Program Coordinator at NGO Committee on the Status of Women, New York, and the UN Coordinator of the Unchained At Last, an ECOSOC accredited US-based organisation that fights to stop early marriage in the US. She recently ended her term as co-chair of Working Group on Girls and co-chair of the NYC for CEDAW. Born in Beirut, Lebanon, into an Armenian family, she moved to New York City in the late 70s with her husband, and together they started a business that grew over 30 employees and 2,000 clientele in the competitive market of Manhattan. Most of Houry's background we will explore as we talk about her story today on this webinar. And I think I'll leave the rest of her introduction to be revealed ever so slowly during our conversation today. It's just a little bit of a different way of approaching the webinar. We'll let that all just be revealed as we speak today. It is my absolute pleasure and privilege to speak with you again today, Houry, and I know that you have a long and proud association with Zonta International in your work at NGO CSW in New York. So, and fresh off a Commissioner status for women, here we are today. So I'm just so looking forward to our conversation.
So am I. I mean, remarkable woman you are, Lynn, for doing this, and especially with Zonta. I can't tell you how honored I am to be here and to be called a remarkable woman. I mean, I'm still working towards that. Let's see.
I think we all are working towards that, Houry. However, you have a very powerful story, and so that's I'm looking forward to sharing that with our guests today. So I'd like to just start our conversation with where and how your story began. So it's over to you.
Thank you. It's interesting because a lot of times I wonder, like, what part do I start with, right? There are, and I'm sure anyone who reflects on their life, they realize there are moments in life that were pivotal, something that happened to them. And one of the interesting things that I say sometimes is, like, if I look back into my life, I see that every 7 years, it seems like something happened that completely turned my life around. So we can literally sit here, I'm 60 now, we can talk from the 7-year-old, 14-year-old, 21-year-old, 28-year-old perspective. But the reality is that my life did change completely at 14 in Beirut, Lebanon. As you said, I am Armenian, born to a first-generation immigrants in Lebanon. My grandparents were survivors of the Armenian genocide who ended up in an orphanage in Lebanon. And then my parents were first-generation Lebanese. And then by the time I was born, we were really well-to-do middle-class family that was enjoying all the wonderful diversity that Lebanon offered, right? We were neighbors with all kinds of people, religions. So that was a lovely way to grow up. But within 14 years of my life, there was already issues with, neighbors and wars. And I don't have to tell you, like, just recently, of course, we watched what happened to Syria. So similarly, Lebanon in 1976 started a civil war that lasted about 20 years. And it really broke up my family completely. And it also was the precipice to really get me married off at that age. which was not something that happened regularly. It wasn't something that was traditional or in our culture or religion. It just was one of those odd situations that I was married. And luckily, it was with a person who was not, he was much older than me, but he was a very kind and generous and hardworking man, and had a friend in New York City. So I think my life actually started when we ended up in New York City within a year, because there was a civil war. There was nothing we could do in Lebanon together. And I got to New York City at 15 and got my general equivalency diploma and started a life. I mean, when I think back now, and I mean, I don't know where the strength or the chutzpah was coming from, but I thought I could conquer the world. And I think that's one of the things about being young, when you're kind of fearless. And then, of course, I lived a fairly easy, well, I shouldn't say easy, it was not that easy, but it was a complicated life, but we achieved a lot together. Eventually, I had 3 boys and raised them right here in New York City. And it was really, at one point, I think it was about 30 years or 25 years into my marriage and successful business and a community leader, I started reflecting on where was my voice and where was my needs, how were they being met? And I started a journey of self-discovery, if you want to call it, and ended up really finding out that I had buried that 14-year-old girl's voice, who was brave, who was amazing, but was not able to really achieve all her goals. And the most important piece of all of this was the lack of education. To me, that was eating up on me. Like, I can't even begin to tell you. I was like, how can I, after all the successes I was having, the education piece was what was really eating up on me. So that, in a nutshell, is what really drove me to really advocate, be an advocate. And of course, working towards gender equality globally. Every single thing I do, I feel like, is a part of my healing as well. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of stories in between all of this, but the bottom line is that I feel very lucky that 10 years ago, I discovered NGO Committee on the Status of Women. I had no idea what UN was all about. I had no idea what global feminists were thinking, or even Zanta. I mean, just think about it. Zanta has been around for so long, and I discovered it 10 years ago along with NGO CSW. And every time I spoke to a woman, and actually Leslie Wright, who's a member, was one of the first women I met who told me about Zanta. And we sat down to have coffee. It was CSW 55, I believe. And she was telling me, and I was like, I can't believe this. I can't believe there's a world out there like this. And then I just have been working nonstop since then.
Yes, it's an incredible story. And I know when we first met, because I knew who you were, and through Zonta, and I knew all about NGO CSW. And like you, I didn't know about NGO CSW until I became really involved internationally with Zonta. So, it's discovery on both sides. About that relationship, which we'll touch on later. But I'd like to take, I guess, you into that space of, you're a successful businesswoman, and maybe we can explore that shortly, with expertise in marketing and public relations, and that long history with nonprofits and academic institutions. And you have a voice, and you speak strongly now about human rights. Can you talk to us about how it came about that this young woman at 15, who left your home country of Lebanon, arrived in the US with all the bright lights, even back then, and you became the woman you are today? So what were some of those steps along the way? I know you talked about getting your GED all those years ago. So maybe could you explore just some of that educational history, and maybe some of those business successes you've had along the way?
Yes, thank you. I love reflecting on those because it is empowering, and I appreciate the opportunity to have that to reflect, right? Because most of the time, especially as you said, we just wrapped up CSW 66, and for 2 weeks I dove into everyone else's stories, right? And you kind of put your story aside and you just celebrate others. So thanks for the opportunity to have this to reflect. What's interesting is that, as I said, even as I arrived to New York City, so excited, by the way, I mean, I was not upset that I got married young. I didn't know how it was going to affect me in any way. I was already a rambunctious, outgoing, big mouth, if you want to call it that, because, I had a very progressive family who took us on trips, and we went out to dinners and watched movies. There was no book that I couldn't read. I was a little bit too old for my 14-year-old self, if you want to call it that. And I think that's one of the reasons why perhaps my family and his family thought that I was ready. But it's still not okay. And I know Zonta cares a lot about early marriage, so I'm very happy to touch upon that. And also, as you mentioned, I am the UN coordinator of Unchained At Last, and I really enjoy being speaking up about that, because every time I talk about the percentages and the laws in the United States, or the lack of in the United States, people are shocked. They go, in the United States, people get married that young? As young as 11, 12, 13-year-olds? I mean, this is a progressive country that has free education until 18 years old, yet that happens. And that shock actually is what drives me, because it's similar to my story. So any Armenian, any Lebanese who finds out that my upper middle class progressive family was able to watch me walk down the aisle with someone 16 years older than me, they're in shock. They go, how did anybody allow that to happen? But it happens, right? And then you need to figure out a way to not make it happen again. So just to go back to your question about the education. So I was a straight A student, and I thought, I'll figure out a way to get back to school. I mean, nobody's going to stop me. I mean, there was no question in my head that I was going to continue my education. Yet again, the Civil War started right after I got married. And then when I got to New York City, I couldn't, we couldn't even figure out how to rent. We had no family here. We had one friend who employed my husband. So that was good. He was busy. He was at work 9 to 6. And I was left in the studio apartment that we figured out how to rent together, with a sofa bed and a coffee table. And I would watch TV and just wonder, how am I going to figure out where are schools here? How do I register for school? And we didn't even have a green card yet. He had a working visa and I had an accompanying visa, is what it's called. And then, of course, there was a commercial that talked about GED, General Equivalency Diploma. Now, the good news is that I had a really good 8th grade education from Lebanon, because the education there is very advanced. I spoke English well, I wrote, obviously, and read very well. I spoke Arabic and Armenian and English. And then I took down a 1-800 number, called it. I think I paid I don't know, it was $19.99 or $29.95, one of those numbers that I charged on my credit card, and I get this booklet. And I figured out all by myself that GED was the equivalence of a high school diploma. And I'm like, okay, I don't even need to go to high school. I'll get my diploma. And sure enough, I did the tests in the book a couple of times. Took the subway, and of course there were all kinds of information. There's no internet, by the way. 1976, you can't Google anything.
No. Nothing.
But there was
television and newspaper, wasn't it? Radio,
exactly.
TV, newspapers, and journals, and the neighbors.
And I have to actually really thank the United States and New York City for having access, because this book had all the information, even numbers to call, where to take the test. And it was somewhere in the Bronx. And I asked people on how I get to the Bronx. It was the first time I took the subway, and I took the test and I passed it, because I took some tests, like the whatever, trials. So yeah, and then of course I was thinking, no, now that I have the high school diploma, I'll figure out how to get to college. But of course that wasn't going to happen that easily and that fast. because we had to make money. So I started working.
So how old were you when you started working?
So I actually was, I think I was about 16 or 17 when I became a lorry girl. And I know that sounds pretty mischievous, but it was a legitimate work. And it was what's called temporary agency. So through my husband's work, I was meeting people, and there was this one young woman who kept seeing me waiting outside of their business to pick him up, and I guess to, do things with him. And she was like, so what do you do now? And I'm like, no, I'm looking for a job. So she said, and she took my hand and walked me over 2-3 blocks on East 53rd Street, I think. His business was on 57. And there was this woman who actually hired us as temporary, like fill-in, people called her and said, we need a secretary, we need a filing clerk, and all of these. And all she said was like, be next to your phone, either late at night or early in the morning. If you pick up the phone, you're the one that fills in. And I ended up working like quite a lot for about 2 years until we decided that we were going to start our own business, because there was a whole other story that was happening with the person that had hired him. So we started our own business when I was 19. So I was lorry girl for a couple of years, and then at 19.
So I think I recall that your husband was a hairdresser, is that right? Yes. And so you went into that business?
That's right.
Together?
That's right. So our first hair salon was on East 58th Street. It was called Vartali. It still exists, and it's on 57th Street. I've divorced 10 years ago, but him and my son are continuing that business. And it really is amazing on how, I guess it's the immigrant story, right? And thanks to, because we were actually even scared. We were like, we don't know anything about business, but I don't know how. You call a number and then they tell you what to do. You call the real estate. I literally was the person that read all the contracts, dealt with the lawyers. I was the business part, and he was the creative part of the business. And then I became the manager, then became the public relation, the marketing expert. And then as our community grew, our status grew, I started getting involved with fundraising. I was not only working, but I was also in the community working through the schools of my children, and all the fancy people in New York City is how I call it. So I started helping with fundraising and creating events.
And it's so much that immigrant story that you talk about. Both, I'm from Australia, and of course today I'm in another state from where I live, but that immigrant story is powerful here, and it's incredibly powerful in the United States historically from a very, very long time ago, even from the amount of history that I understand. So I was wondering, could we move on to that notion of the importance of education? And particularly in Centre International, we see education as the core, education of women and girls. It doesn't, particularly for girls, but women too. At any point, I was just talking to a young person yesterday, I think, out of school, saying, well, you're never locked out of the tertiary education sector. It's not a lockstep linear progress any longer. You can always access a university education of any level in our countries. And I know it's the same in the US. So what's your view on the importance of education from your life and what you see now, particularly for women and girls, and that link to gender equality and the pursuit of that? So I'm just interested in your perspectives there, Houry.
Absolutely. So I mean, like I said earlier, this has been, there's quite a few things that was wrong about me getting married so young, even though, as I said, I was lucky to have the privilege of having an opportunity to grow as a person while married so young, and became successful, right? So a lot of people, and whenever I would complain about not being able to go to school, people would say, well, why do you need education? you've achieved so much, what's more important, sometimes there are people with PhDs who can't even get a job. There's that argument about, is education really what makes a person, and I understand that. I'm not saying that. I have come around to believe that I'm not less of a person because I didn't have the degree. But I know for a fact, and of course I had access to lots of reading. I educated myself as much as possible. I still remember on any day off or on morning or an afternoon off, I would go to the New York City Public Library on Fifth Avenue. And the privilege of being able to walk in there and look at books and pull out books to read, or any topic that I was interested in. Most of the time it wasn't fashion or beauty, even though that's what I was making my money. There were so many things that I was interested in. It just felt so good to have that privilege. And partly because I felt like there are things that I probably don't know, even though I am successful, even though I am smart. I was able to talk to anybody under the table, as my family would say. I could argue because I read newspapers, I listened to the news, but that wasn't enough. There was something missing. I always felt like there was something missing in me. And that really took a long time for me to get over. And then, of course, finally, once my kids were all in school, I took it in my hands to start college. I think it was about 20 years ago now. And my youngest one was in elementary school, and Fordham University, we lived right next to Fordham University on 10th Avenue. If anybody's in New York City, they know what I'm talking about. And I remember I used to joke with my friends, I live on campus, because I was right next to the university and I would walk right in. And the joy that I felt taking credits, and I would do like 3 to 6 credits a semester. And I thought it was going to take me 20 years to finish. And it actually literally did take me almost 20 years to finish. And I finally got my degree a few years ago. But it wasn't because, it was because I was busy. I had a life, but I just couldn't give up on it. I think just having that diploma, because of emotionally what it did to me growing up, was important to me. Now, am I smarter? I don't know. I definitely enjoyed every single class I took. And I actually ended up taking international gender equality degree from the CUNY baccalaureate program. And just being in a classroom with diverse young people was just such a gift, while I was also volunteering at NGO CSW. So it was a really good opportunity for me to finally finish it with that degree.
So how do you now see that link between education and gender equality? Because in our world, we're still, according to the most recent Global Gender Gap report from the World Economic Forum, we're still more than 140 years away from gender equality globally. Some countries are much closer than others, but globally that far away. And on top of that, we've had the pandemic, and all of the research and reading and listening I've done in this last 2 years talks about that disproportionate effect on women and girls from the pandemic. So, and the pandemic hasn't been something that's hit and gone. We're still, and I know globally, we're still struggling with it. We're struggling here in Australia, and as you are. So,
and it's going to be years to recover from that.
So if we think it's 140 years last year in the 2021 report, it's a bit terrifying as to what it might become in the next couple of years, and whether it continues to improve or not. So what's your view on that, or even the view within the world you work? And you're fresh off the Commission of Status for Women, the annual in New York. So where's that at in terms of education, pandemic, and gender equality?
Well, I'm pretty sure we're talking to an expert audience as we speak, because I know Zanta is so well versed on this, but I do always like to put twists to this and hope that, and again, I'm always open to even getting feedback on how is it that we can convince not just patriarchy, who put us in this situation, in this position. I mean, honestly, at the end of the day, we need to figure out a way to end patriarchy once and for all. But patriarchy exists because we as women are marginalized, and we see ourselves in so many ways, most of the time as the nurturers rather than the leaders and the ones who really should take things into our own hands. And I'm not saying this is 100%, and I would be even cautious to generalize it too much. But I know from my lifetime, from my circles, what I have seen, and personally myself, I remember thinking, oh, I can handle this. I will just take care of my family first. I will take care of my husband and my parents, and then I'll think about myself. So one of the things I like to talk about is why gender equality is important. Why is it important to really separate and highlight women and girls, especially when we say gender equality is a woman's right, right? And human right. It's women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. We know that. I like to repeat that. And then, of course, when you say that, generally speaking, men or patriarchy says, well, then why separate yourselves from it? You know, why can't we just provide it for everyone? Everyone should have access to education. Well, the bottom line is that, just as I mentioned, for women and girls, there is a disproportionate difference. There are many families who would first send their sons or make sure their sons are protected, and girls can always stay home and take care of the family or feed or clean or find a job to support and take care of the elderly, right? I mean, and it starts as young as 12, 13-year-old girls taking care of either their older relatives or their younger siblings. And that right away is a perfect example of why we need to make sure, just because we're used to doing that, just because that has been acceptable, doesn't mean we have to keep doing it that way, right? We have to make sure that we consciously educate families, societies, communities, and say, even if instinctively, you know your child can handle it, just like my parents thought I'm such a smart aleck that I could handle it. So they gave me this responsibility. And yeah, not only I handled it, I mastered it, but that still is not okay. It took me years to recover personally, to find a voice that I have, that I can speak proudly right now. I could speak up for everybody else. I could speak up for my husband, for my children, for my family. I could speak up the rights of the genocide. I mean, I could speak up for everyone else, but it took me a long time, first of all, for me to admit to myself that what happened to me was not okay. And then that to also be able to share it with others, because there was also this guilt feeling of like, I don't want my parents or my husband to feel bad. I don't, because I know that they didn't intentionally hurt me. They thought this was the best solution. Well, it wasn't, because anytime you don't allow someone a choice, right? I mean, it wasn't a forced marriage, but I didn't feel like I had a choice. If my parents sat me down and said, well, you're not going to be able to go to school anymore. Would you like to go to school or start your life as a married woman? I know I would have picked school. I just didn't think I had that choice. I thought, well, I'm getting married now, but I'll go to school anyway. That's how much I had convinced myself that it was okay. So yeah, it's really important to educate about education, educate families about education.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that I find that having got to my years, somewhat older than you are, Houry, and back when I was 20, with a very different entry into life from yourself, I always believed that when I got to my age, we'd have fixed it all. What a silly belief I had at 20. Wow. But that, when I say fixed it all, somewhere in my mind I thought, well, you know, I'm a feminist, and I want the best for girls, and I want it to be, I want to have the best life. And like you, I don't know when I found my voice. I probably think I only found it 10 or 15 years ago, truly and really. And that thing about, and this is probably not politically correct, but it's often in our minds, we sometimes marginalize ourselves because we don't actually believe that we can have that voice and that we are equal. Yep. I'm putting that on myself, not on anyone else. And then when we're also marginalized in society, absolutely, in the way that we speak of, and I'm speaking generally about women and girls, not specifically, yeah. It's a real double thing. It's like a double whammy, as we'd say here. And it's interesting, isn't it?
Absolutely. You really hit it right on the nail, because, and part of the reason is because we are, I mean, I hate to say it, we are more capable. Women and girls are stronger. And I'm not talking about physically, of course, the testosterone, the muscles can probably lift a heavier rock than I can, right? But I think the fact that we can give birth, that we can nurture, that we can support. I mean, I've seen it even in my women friendships, right? The way we can actually rise to the occasion, the way we volunteer, the way we support each other is so different than the male instinct. It's an instinct that we have, right? And that because we have that strength, I feel like, anyway, my own opinion is that I feel like, well, I'm a survivor. I can do it. Like, I'm strong. It doesn't matter if my needs were not met at this level or the next level. I'll figure out a way to make it through. Because I could see how I was actually more confident than my husband, even though he had the creative aspect of the business, and he was older, he was more well-traveled, but there was insecurities in him that I felt like I need to cover up for and not worry about my own issues. So my issues were always pushed aside, and his needs were, and I've seen that this happen in so many households. And part of it is because I could convince myself to say, oh, you're strong enough, you'll get there, don't worry about it. And sure enough, I was strong enough and I did get there. I ended up having to do it by leaving, getting a divorce, and then really speaking up for other women until I was able to speak my own story. So when I started at NGO CSW, actually, I didn't tell my story until 5 years into my volunteering. After I heard so many other brave women speak up, I finally thought, okay, I can talk about this. And it's still kind of hard. It's still kind of new for me to be sitting here. And in my head, I'm thinking, I wonder how many people are going to hear this story and laugh at me or judge me or, or think that this is crazy. I mean, who would do something like this? But, you have to get past that, because to me, what's important is that I heard other women tell these stories that empowered me. And I'm hoping at least some part of my story will help and empower someone else to say, I'm ready to tell my story.
And the feedback I hear from everyone in my circle and more broadly around Zonta and outside of Zonta, because this webinar goes more broadly than Zonta, is the notion of sharing stories and storytelling about ourselves and where we've come. And we're about to pursue some of those more personal questions about leadership in just now, as you know, is what resonates with people. I now finally have some women in my circle who say, when's the next one and who's your guest? And they're starting, oh, I missed that one. Oh, I bet, well, they're on demand. You go back, I'm doing a plug, aren't I? You go back and you can look at them anytime or listen to them. We now do them audio, so you can take them with you. But they like that story, that powerful story, Houry. That's what is resonating. And so, I'm honored that you are choosing to share it with me today and with us who are watching, because I think that's the power, that other women think, oh, I can have a voice. And like you, having a voice to me seems the most important thing in life. Do I have a voice? And can I continue to have that always, no matter where I am in the aging or life cycle? It's always having that voice.
Never too late.
It's never too late. So speaking of having a voice, you mentioned before about the women's rights to human rights and human rights to women's rights, of course, which is the core of the Zonta International belief and mission. And the partnership well, firstly, the consultative status that Zonta International holds with the UN ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council. And many in the Zonta world have been part of the recent NGO CSW forums, albeit that they're virtually. And this year, of course, some of them were in person, I believe, in New York. It's my dream to get there one day. So can you talk to us a little bit about the work of the NGO CSW and then the partnership with Zonta and how that plays out? Because I think the work that your organisation does is critical in your relationship with the UN. So over to you.
Absolutely. And it is it's actually a key part of who I am right now. And I know I'm not going to be here forever. This is not an organization that, you know, it definitely has leadership change. I have one more year as chair, and I can't wait to be ex officio and then watch the new leadership take it to the next level. But in the 10 years, like obviously 10 years ago, I was just a visitor, and I had a badge from, at the time, an Armenian organization. I watched incredible women give so much of themselves and their intelligence and experience and passion, right? Like they would show up to these monthly meetings and listen to each other, support each other, help each other. And I thought, this is the community that I want to be in. I want to be around like-minded people who bring their own, whatever background, experience and knowledge or education you have, and then kind of make it a mixed soup of everything, right? Just bring all of it together and see what comes up. And for so many years, I've seen incredible women do that and be inspired by them. And Zonta is, like I said, the first person I met was a Zonta person, Leslie Wright. And then now, of course, I work with Pamela Morgan. And in between, I have met so many of them. And I like that dynamic because the organization I represented at the time, Armenian Relief Society, was similar in a much smaller scale because there's not that many Armenians around the world to begin with. But it was a 100-year-old organization that had chapters in countries, and they had ECOSOC accreditation as well. And I could see the potential of really bringing global activists together under one umbrella of advocacy, and then mixing up all of your different approaches for an ultimate goal of equality. Because I mean, and that's one of the things I keep saying even these days, where as long as we keep our focus in what is the ultimate goal is access for gender equality globally. So as long as you keep that in the goal, how we get there, who does what, if the ultimate result can lead us to that, it's absolutely fine. There's so many different ways of getting there. Now, the issue becomes, and I have noticed that, so it's taken me, and well, I just want to say one thing before I go into some of the issues that I have experienced and what has made me the leader that I am right now, or the way I lead right now. Because I mean, it's all been a learning process, right? I mean, being a business leader is so different than being an activist and an advocacy leader. But when I first got into this space, I remember feeling so little. First of all, I didn't have my degree yet. And I was coming from a beauty and fashion industry. And I thought, they're going to look down on me, like who, because that's so shallow. Like I didn't even care about fashion and beauty by then, right? Why would they care what I think? And I remember at the time, Sun Young Yoon, who had just become chair, looked at me, and I don't know what she had done. I don't know if she had Googled me or she saw that I had some kind. She said, Houry, please do not put yourself down. Your experience of event organizing, fundraising, or even the way you think, because of your background, your like even the lack of education and your passion for education can really be useful in the group. And that really empowered me to speak up in meetings, for example, right? But then what happens is that over the years, so that started me into like saying, okay, and I would watch them and I would listen to everybody's advice. And then eventually, inevitably, just like Pamela Morgan usually in meetings goes, I hear you, Houry, but what about this, right? And then you bring all these mixture of ideas and you come up with a solution that couldn't be there without that collaboration, without that camaraderie, without that sisterhood is what I would like to call. The problem I noticed, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, what I was going to say, so that is that about the power of the collective, the power of joining people together, and you almost end up with a web. You know, we think of a spider's web and how sticky and how they are really hard to tear apart.
Yes.
You know,
Thank
so
you.
to me, it's I can't help myself with metaphors, but it's that piece as you're speaking, that's what it feels like to me. So
absolutely. And it's a perfect example. And thank you so much for like really putting it together, because it is important to reword it on how, because somebody else will think of it in a different way. But it's the perfect example of what Zanta does as well, right? With the chapters and, you know, and that's what NGO CSW's goals are. We have regional chapters, and then we also are, you know, centered. So the issue that I noticed, and it's important to address this, because just because we're all in the same space and we have the same ideas, I noticed that it doesn't mean that we all have the nature or the nurture of really being accepting of each other. And one of the biggest issues I've seen in this global feminist movement, and I'm so determined to keep working about bringing more partnerships and bringing more global feminist movements together, the way Zanta partners with NGO CSW. You know, doesn't matter, like we're not in competition, because we're, like I said, our ultimate goal is that gender equality for all, right? How you go about it, how we go about it, and how we share the space together is what matters. But what I notice is that sometimes women and girls who have not had the opportunity to reflect and grow individually bring toxic masculinity and the notions of patriarchy into our space. And the first couple of times I noticed, I was like, wait a minute, these are our sisters. They have suffered just as much as I have for different reasons. Maybe they didn't have early marriage, but they had sexual assault or, you know, or whatever issues. Because 1 out of 3, remember, if we are 5 people in a room, there's going to be 1 or 2 who has a story that has affected her as a woman, right? So, but if we have not addressed it, if we have not looked into it deeply, personally, it will affect the collective. So it's really important to keep encouraging each other to grow on an individual level so that we can collectively grow together too. Now, what do we do about that toxic space? We have to address it. We can't just say, oh, it's just her, it's okay. You know, she's just that way. She just is negative all the time. Don't worry about it. Well, perhaps we can ignore 1 or 2 people, but I think addressing it collectively is really important. And with my executive committee team, what we have brought together to the table, and it's still work in progress. There's no way I can say that we have discovered the solution of global feminist movements and we're going to be perfect going forward. No, never, because that's not how humanity works. But one of the things that we've introduced, and I've noticed that it does help people, is when you think of it as a collaborative, transparent, shared leadership model. Because one of the things that happens and how patriarchy was even created, right, was because of power struggle. Patriarchy wants to diminish because they want the power. So if I disarm you by saying, well, we're equal anyway, like, I'm not going to give you the power. We're going to have to share this power. And even if I'm the chair, the leader, I'm telling you, you're as equal as I am. I'm hoping to disarm that kind of patriarchy that we are bringing into the circle. Doesn't always work, but I am determined to keep trying.
And it's so important to do that. And through the organisation that you're currently working in, there's power there of that collective and the power of connection and collaboration and all of those things. I'm just reminded of the saying, the behaviour I walk past is the behaviour I accept. And that mixes with the voice we were talking earlier and the calling it out that you speak about, you know, the power of the voice not to walk past things that we know are not right or they're not appropriate. And that takes courage. It takes all the things that we've been alluding to so far today. And I'm watching the time, it's moving on so quickly. So it's so quickly, and I'm thinking, oh, I could talk with you for hours. So with that in mind, talk to me about leadership and the importance of leadership, because the underpinning theme in this, without using the word, is about leadership, self-leadership, leadership of others. So what do you think your powers and gifts are? And how do you use those in your work?
Well, that was a good segue, actually. We didn't even plan it. I don't know how you're doing this. You're very good at what you do. And I'm sorry if I talk way too much, but I get so passionate.
Oh, no, there's no talking too much here. It's just me working to get another theme going, because this one is so important as well in your work, mine and everybody's.
But that is a very good segue, because when I talk about collaborative, transparent, shared leadership model, which people have been hearing me say this for the last year or so, and sometimes I see people rolling their eyes, like, what is that? Is that a trick? Is that a way of you not taking responsibility? Is that a way of just appeasing me? No, it's real. And I mean that. Now, when I say that, I also, what I usually add at the end is also that, but at the end of the day, I am the chair. If I do need to make a final decision, if I see that a decision needs to be made and we're not able to bring it together in a collaborative shared leadership model, I am not afraid. So being brave is one of the things that we have to accept, right? You have to be strong. You have to be, you have to have a resolve in your, like, again, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I have to say it. For me, waking up and knowing that the ultimate goal is gender equality for all, global gender equality. So everything I'm talking to you about, every step that I'm taking, decisions that I'm helping make with my community, with my executive committee, if it leads towards that, if it access to gender equality, then I'm not doing anything wrong. I mean, I'm not taking anything away from anybody. Now, how we get there needs to be as transparent and collaborative as possible. So we put the topics on the table. For example, this year, we shifted a lot into more advocacy than ever before. NGO CSW has been known to collecting global women together, and we have conversation circles, we do parallel events, we do fabulous artisan fair, we have reception, we have wonderful events together, and we do advocacy as well. But for the past year, advocacy has emerged as the most important thing, because one of the things that I kept hearing people say is that it's great that we're gathered, it's great that we have an outcome document, but if we're not implementing, if we're not holding our governments accountable, it's like running in circles. So we keep talking about, yeah, this is important, but we're not really getting it done. So if that's the goal, then all topics that I put on the table for implementation accountability, yes, then we need advocacy. Doesn't matter how we get there. That's when you really allow all the voices to come into that table, let's say, and then make a decision on how to go forward. And if you see that it's a Babylon, or, you know, things are, they're not really, that, then you have to be brave enough to say, I hear you all, I thank you, and this is our final decision to move forward. So people are heard, though, right?
Yes, it's making sure that everyone has a voice, but in the end, who's the accountable person for the decision, who carries that forward, and where does the power of the decision lie, or the delegation of the decision lie? And that's that piece of all of us that somewhere in our lives we come to understand whether I currently have the power of the decision, or does the power of the decision live somewhere else, and when am I going to influence? And then when do I back away when I realise that I've had my go at influencing? I'm not able to change this outcome, but I've had a voice. But it's not I don't have the authority to make the decision in the end. I have the authority to influence. So it's a really interesting space once we come around to realizing that, isn't it? And I think you've articulated that so very clearly. I would normally ask about tough challenges and roadblocks we've faced and how you've overcome that. But I think we've covered that, because you talked about that much earlier about some of those key roadblocks in your life. So I'll take that as probably read, unless there's something else you'd like to add, because I'd like to move on to, what do you do when your confidence takes a hit, or when your resilience is down? How do you work that through or recover? What's your go-to?
That is an excellent question too, because I'm not always optimistic. I am naturally an optimistic human being. I am naturally one that believes that if you keep smiling, joy will come, even through darkness. And because I have experienced so much darkness in my past, let's say from my grandparents, my parents, and I have found that, yes, definitely smiling and keeping an optimistic view helps. Yet, yes, I do have many moments, too many moments to mention. And of course, therapy and girlfriends and self-help books and Oprah and all of those things, they all help, right?
And listening to the stories of others and how they've overcome it. And that's why I asked that question, because people say, well, that really helps us to think about how we work through our own misfortunes or troubles or issues that confront us. Sometimes they might be micro and sometimes they're macro, and it's so important. So when you get some free time and when you're not terribly busy, what do you like to do? Because good leaders always look after themselves and look for things that sustain them. So what's one of your go-tos?
So one of my, and people have always said I'm so outgoing, I'm always busy, I'm always doing something. And every time they say things like that, I go, really? Because for me, the highlight of my day, week, month, even when I was raising 3 kids, I had 30 employees and had this huge social life. I always found moments of quiet. And I never understood what that was. I needed that to regenerate, right? But it is meditation. And I'm not a huge religious person. I happen to be Christian. My mom does go to church and makes me go once a year. But I noticed why religion was born and why it's necessary, because those who really practice religion once a week or sit in prayer, I see how important that is. So that to me is the most important, because even with therapy, friends, books, everything I told you, I think true discovery of myself at the end of the day has come from those quiet moments. The answers has always been inside me. It's when I'm not confident, it's when I'm scared, when I'm sad, feeling sorry for myself, that I forget that I have the answers. Now, it's not always easy to find that. And one of the things I have discovered is that just wait a day before you give up completely on this idea. Wait a day. And I usually advise my kids the same thing. I say, if it really looks horrible, just even if you can wait 2 hours, give yourself a couple of hours or a day usually. And I've always been shocked at how it gets resolved. I don't know how, because I'm not God. I don't know the answers all the time, but that quiet moment and that patience of saying, okay, this feels so horrible. I don't know how to resolve it. It's not good, but I'm going to wait a day. And then it gets resolved.
I think my line is, nothing's so terrible that I can't sleep on it and it'll look better in the morning, because the sun will come up somewhere in the world and it'll look better in the morning. It's like, and sometimes it's true, or a lot of the time it's true. I have another little saying that says, get up, show up, and wear red lipstick. It's that case of, you were talking about optimism. So there's a lot of one-liners we can have in life, aren't there, Houry? So what's next for you? What do you think might come next? I have one more year.
Yeah, I do have one more year as chair, and we just had a debriefing today, actually, and I'm excited at the trajectory that we have. And honestly, I do not know what's next after NGO CSW. I know that I'm always going to be in this space. I know that something will come up, and sometimes I get anxious, and this is actually a perfect example. Sometimes I think, because this is not a paid job, right? And I've been able to manage with just a little bit of consultancy here and there. And luckily, like I said, I worked for 35 years and saved enough money. I can support myself, but I'm too young to say I'm completely retired. So sometimes I get worried and I say, well, is this it? Like, you're just going to volunteer for the rest of your life, or is it? And then I get anxious and I go, I'll wait. Like in this case, it's not a day. I'm going to wait a year and see what happens.
And it's interesting, isn't it? It's that we have a voice, we have power, we have education, and we have experience. And like you, I'm not sure that retirement exists. I think it's what we stop doing what we've been doing and we move to do something new and different. And it could be volunteer, it could be paid workforce, it could be our own skills that'll carry us through. So am I hearing it's like, if you have faith in yourself, something will emerge, perhaps?
Exactly. I mean, just like NGO CSW emerged, you know, I'll just end with this one thought. With all the success after I got divorced and fired from the business that we created together, I like to say that, but it's of course a joke. I did walk away. I actually could not find a job in my community. I didn't want in the beauty and fashion, but I had this client list of 2,000 people, and I reached out and I said, anybody, management, fundraising, event organizing, I could not find a job. And I just kept myself open to what's next. Just show me the way. And then NGO CSW showed up.
And remember, and we all have experience and skills that other people want to access. So I think, and that's what this series is about, and my conversation with you today. A final thought for people today, a final thought for me and everyone listening today. What might that be?
I love this one saying that has been driving me in my position right now. I think it's Fannie Lou Hamer said it. I don't know if she created it, but I heard her say it. She's this sharecropper that was a voting advocate in the 60s. And if anybody doesn't know about her, please Google her, Fannie Lou Hamer. And she's got this 1964 speech at the Democratic Convention that brings me to my knees all the time. She said, nobody's free until everybody is free. I'm not free. I'm not successful until everybody is. And I really do believe in that. I don't want to succeed for myself. I want to succeed for all of us. Whatever I can do to bring as many people as possible with me is what drives me. So that's the saying I want to leave with.
Houry, thank you. What a delightful conversation today. And thank you so much for your generosity and the power of your voice and what we've heard today. Go well, go safely into the next year and the work that you're doing with NGO CSW, and congratulations on that work. And thank you so much for sharing your powerful story today. I've just had the best hour, and I'm starting my day on this hour, so thank you. And
thank you, Lynn.
In order to wrap up the conversation, our next webinar will be released at the end of May, and our guest will be announced shortly. Thank you, everybody watching this today, for being a great promoter of the stories of our remarkable guests. Spread the word. You'll find all our recordings of previous webinars on YouTube and at zonta.org, news and events. And I look forward to seeing you next time. And once again, Houry, thank you incredibly.
Pleasure, Lynn. Thank you for what you do.